Hi, this is Howard Jacobson. I'm here with Colin Campbell, Dr. T. Colin Campbell, co-author of The China Study and author of the brand new book just coming out, Whole: Rethinking the Science of Nutrition. I helped. I'm at the bottom there. And I wanted to, after all the work we've done on this, and it's kind of finally come to fruition, I just wanted to talk with you big picture. We've been, immersed in so many details and figuring things out. Kind of go back to the beginning, and of course, the China Study was a book that I don't know that anyone really thought it was going to become the phenomenon that it did. It sold now over 1 million copies. It's been at the top of the Amazon bestseller list for 7 or 8 years now. What made you want to write another book?
Well, the China Study, as we've talked before, is in a sense the how or what. What is the evidence? I obviously, over the many years that I was in research, I got some ideas of where I thought all this was leading to. And I wanted to see if it was possible to actually write down what that evidence was, tell it in a kind of a narrative or story. And I didn't know for sure, what the end was going to look like. I'm not sure what the objective was, other than simply to see if I could write down what I thought I'd come to know. So that's the what. And it might put it that way. The whole is an attempt to explain why. In other words, when I started the book and working with Tom at the time, we didn't actually even know what the outline was going to look like. You're familiar with that idea, trying to figure out the outline. But so it ended up being a story in a sense. Came up with something we thought was useful to know. But it still was something like 99% maybe confident, but not quite 100%. I never could say that. So we did say in the book at one point, you don't need to believe me, it says, just try it. Mm-hmm. And so that has turned out to be, that turned out to be a kind of a neat little trick. It wasn't meant to be a trick, but and there was just expression of my own incomplete confidence, I suppose. And it's turned out to be fantastic.
Right. Well, it certainly follows the principle of first do no harm.
Right.
Right. There's no evidence that a whole foods plant-based diet has ever hurt anybody.
I think that's a fair statement, right? Right.
At least compared to the other interventions that our society likes to use, like medicine and surgery.
Right.
Right. So
pills and procedures.
Right. So I mean, one of the amazing facts that I discovered in our work together is the number of annual deaths caused by the medical establishment.
Right.
So the third leading cause of death in America is medicine. Right. So certainly telling people that they can improve their lives by eating mostly plants as close to their natural state as possible. Certainly a responsible thing to do. So that's the China Study. And so one thing that we talked about very early on was that you had a sense that once you presented, it wasn't 100%, but so compelling, so much evidence from so many different fields, from your lab, from the data in China, from clinicians doing incredible work, that it just seemed like it was natural that people were going to adopt this for their own good. And it was a little bit surprising that people didn't. That obviously it's had a huge impact on millions of people, but still we're still fighting an uphill battle to share this information. And partly that was one of the questions that caused you to start writing another book. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, right. I use metaphors like you do. Sometimes I felt like I was rowing Queen Elizabeth across the Atlantic with one oar, or swimming up Niagara Falls, like a fish. Didn't quite work. I mean, the problem of trying to introduce this idea to the public is not easy. I mean, some very powerful institutions, as you know. They're very much fixed in place, and oftentimes their power is very subtle, but nonetheless very powerful. And I can talk to people, I'm sure as you've talked to people too. You can sit down and have a conversation with them, and actually get them pretty engaged in this and maybe even convinced about it. But that's only that's a necessary first step. But for a lot of people, that's not enough.
Mm-hmm.
They just can't quite believe that it can have so much power as it does.
Right. And in fact, I just finished taking the T. Colin Campbell Foundation course on nutrition, and one of the modules, the assignment was talk to someone who says, "How do you get your protein?" As someone who doesn't consume a lot of animal products. And I'm curious, where did that idea come from? Because it's not, no one says, where do you get your fiber, where do you get your lycopene? It's protein. As you explored the research that led to Whole, where did that come from, this idea that protein is so important, and what sustains it in our society today?
Well, that question, my own personal history in a sense goes back a long ways, because my doctoral dissertation, in fact, was to essentially promote the consumption of more protein, especially high quality protein, namely animal-based protein. That's what I did for my dissertation. That's what I did, in fact, in my first position on the faculty, and that was to go to the Philippines with my senior colleague and attempt there, too, also to make sure all these folks got enough protein, especially the malnourished children. So, that was just a given. No one ever questioned that. That's the more the better. The more the better. And but then, of course, we saw what we saw. That was reported in the China study. First off, just in that animal study on a single kind of cancer, but the effects were so dramatic, and they were demonstrating some what I would call principles. In those days, I tended to call them heresies, because you make an observation and you knew it was just totally off the chart. No one's going to believe this. But eventually, we had enough of those that I converted them over to principles. And the protein thing in that study was, in fact, to show that a very high quality protein, cow's milk protein, for example, was able to turn on the cancer, turn on the growth, take it away, suppress it, or replace it with plant protein, again, suppress it. And so that observation, along with some, and looking at it many different ways, just convinced me that this effect of protein had never been reported before, I thought. And it was very dramatic, and I thought very important. So then I had to go back and question my own, not only my own dissertation, my own early learning and my own early teaching, but even my personal life. I'm just like everybody else. Protein was everything. I was raised on a farm. Protein was the name of the game, essentially, to the extent that I knew anything about that. Right. And I thought a lot about it since. I guess in an interesting ways I think that now I can talk about why, what is the recommendation for protein? What does that really mean? And how much is enough? Where do we get it from?
Well, it's interesting to me that you would find such a dramatic protein effect that no one had ever reported before. There was that sort of ambiguous study from India that that kind of
that was a turnkey thing in a sense.
Kind of a turnkey to get you to even begin to ask the question.
Right.
But there's a lot of forces in place in our society that would make it very hard for someone to even ask the question. In a sense, you were lucky, you were courageous, you had the right kind of funding, but it's the sort of question that doesn't tend to get asked, which gets to kind of one of the main points of Whole, which is the difference between what we call reductionist research and what you call holistic, with a W, holistic research. Could you talk a little bit about what is considered good research by the medical, the scientific, the establishment, the government, the media, and what's wrong with it?
Well, thinking in the context of nutrition, which incidentally was one of the objectives in the very beginning for my wanting to do this book, and that was to redefine the word nutrition. What's it really mean? Here I've been in the field all these years, teaching it, was trained in it, and still not knowing for sure what was the meaning of that word. I knew that it wasn't quite right, there was something wrong. And I finally have landed on a couple of observations that I think are important to make. Number one, the question concerning the amount of protein we consume tends to either directly or indirectly influence you know, a recommendation for all kinds of other nutrients as well. As a really big force, our views about protein, our unquestioned views about protein. The other one is the idea of working with single nutrients. You know, and our whole society does this. We have labels on the side of our food boxes. You know, single nutrients are listed. We make recommendations for single nutrients, and we be very precise in exactly how much is needed. We define foods in terms of exactly how much of different nutrients are in them. And we do all these things, you know, as if each individual nutrient essentially is telling us a big story. And I'm trying to realize that doesn't work that way. You know, our whole sense of knowing, you know, something about this field is premised on thinking about individual nutrients one at a time. We did our research that way. I taught that way. I mean, we're so totally immersed in that idea that suddenly when you stand back and you look and wait a minute, that's not what it's about. That's the part. All these individual nutrients are a part. They're a part of something bigger, the whole. And the whole in this particular case, to get a little more specific, is the food. And even there's a bigger whole there. It's not individual foods that do all the work that needs to be done. It's all of it working together. It's not even foods as we know that too. It's the rest of the lifestyle that tend to support that. And it's not even our personal lifestyle. It's not only the lifestyle for us humans. It's the lifestyle for, you know, the surroundings within which we live. So there's always somehow a bigger whole all the time. Mm-hmm. And it all started out with this idea of just trying to define nutrition. It's exciting, I think. I found it really, after being in all these years and being so naive and I guess not seeing even that myself.
Right. Well, we have a couple of dictionary definitions of nutrition that we talk about in the book. One of them makes it seem like it's very linear, sort of. It's the sum of all the stuff we eat goes into our bodies and does something very predictable. Right. So if you get this much protein, you get this much vitamin A, you get this much vitamin C, you just put it together in the right amounts, you'll know exactly how much you're getting. And you found that's not the case.
Right. We can choose some individual things, some parts of plants, if you will, maybe throw in some nutrients, put it in a bowl, stir it all up, and we can make a dating show almost. With Dr. Liu, he wanted to get funding from NIH, and I'm quite familiar with that program. I'm on both sides of the table there. One really is required essentially to focus the hypothesis. That's considered good science. And you know, to get the funding, to pass the test, to get rated high enough to get the research, you've got to really focus the hypothesis. I know that story very well.
And what do you mean by focus your hypothesis? Give me an example of a focused versus an unfocused hypothesis.
An example of a focused hypothesis in the case of nutrition is to look at one nutrient, search out what is the mechanism by which it works in order to explore its main effect. So it's very linear. Nutrient through this mechanism, the mechanism to produce that outcome.
So in other words, maybe giving people mega doses of vitamin E to see if it prevents lung cancer.
Right. And a lot of the observations that are made on vitamin E, if you use that example, or other vitamins, one goes into the scientific literature, you can just, it's one after another, they're telling about some specific effect of vitamin E, or maybe it's a metabolite, or another vitamin E analog, one thing at a time, always focused, and oftentimes working for the mechanism. I have to tell you a little story on that. I don't know whether it was in the book or not, but I was working for years, starting with that presumption myself, looking for the mechanism, eventually decided there was no such thing. Every time we looked for one, we found one. And so, I was sort of making that point, but we had to go back every 3 years for additional funding. Very competitive process. And finally, after about, I think it was the 8th time or 9th time, over those not many years, I got the last round of funding. I got a feedback from the reviewers. Said, you need to look for the mechanism. And that made me mad. For one thing, they came back and said that. They said, you've got to find the mechanism. And then they turned around and said something else that I thought was kind of stupid, to be honest about it. They were basically not agreeing with the general observation we had made for years that calories are not really what matter. again focused on calories as if there's a specific substance when it's nothing more than a measurement of heat. And so it was every time I sort of turned around, I always had to face these questions. And I did. That was the last time, and I got that review. And I said, I'm not doing this anymore. I realized I just couldn't do what, in fact, was demanded. Mm-hmm. And so I decided to close the lab down.
Right. And some of the things that you share, I was really interested and almost shocked to discover is that, first of all, the amount of a given nutrient in a piece of food can vary 40-fold. You have two peaches, one in each hand. One peach could have 40 times the vitamin C of another.
Right.
Depending even on where it grew on the tree.
That's right, even then. Or the season of the year.
The season of the year.
Right.
Where, so at that point, anyone with a brain is already going, I shouldn't be looking at the amounts of these micronutrients.
That's right.
The second thing was that the micronutrients interact with each other.
Right.
That one can dampen a second or can enhance its activity, so that if you're looking for an individual mechanism, it's almost like counting the number of B flats in a Beethoven symphony. Right. And saying that's what matters. We got to know the B flats are the thing that make the Fifth Symphony so great.
Right.
And that there's gazillions of these nutrients that we may not even have identified yet. Right? There's no one's come up with a precise number. Getting back to Dr. Liu and the apple.
That's right.
He kept on finding more and more things. But I think the thing I found so interesting was he measured the antioxidant.
Vitamin C-like antioxidant. Yeah.
Vitamin C-like antioxidants in an apple,
right.
And he got some number. I could look it up. You could look it up.
There's about 100 times more or something.
And then when he looked at the activity, it was 263 times. I remember that number because I kept doing the math because I didn't believe it. I remember that number very well. 263 times more antioxidant activity than antioxidants. It's as if you have $100 in the bank and you have a debit card, and your debit card allows you to spend $26,300 off of that $100. It's that astounding.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And yet our society and our doctors and our media and our government and our research still insists that the important thing is to look for these individual nutrients and their individual effects.
Right. That's the name of the game. You said it. And as a matter of fact, for me, that has almost been defined as science. And that's a really troubling thought, because that's what I came to learn. With my colleagues, either as a reviewer on those panels, or getting papers published or such like that. There was always this tendency. It was good people just always thinking, you've got to come down and to be specific. That's science. That's really good science. And whereas I can accept, it's a good idea to learn some things in detail, obviously. But that's not the whole world.
Right. Well, I think we make the point in the book that there's nothing wrong with that kind of exploration. It's fascinating. Yeah. It produces some useful results. It expands the frontiers of knowledge. But the point is that that's the only research for which funding is available.
That's right.
So, the biggest criticism of the China study, the study itself, not the book, is that it's a observational study. It's not real science, right? It's not. That's right. It's not proof.
That's right. Good example.
And so anyone who's looking for the big picture is not going to get funding for it.
That's right. That's considered. We call it a shotgun approach or a fishing expedition.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about the funding, because that's the kind of the two big parts of the book are this idea of reductionism, that only looking at parts and missing the big picture. And the second is what you call subtle power, the subtle power of money. And that the subtle power of money is very, very happy with the reductionist worldview, because that's how it maintains its power and makes more money. So where does the funding come from that skews research in this way?
By the way, that subtle power thing, I made those inferences about subtle power. I want to give you credit for, actually explicitly saying that. When you said the subtle power of industry, release the power, still power. I mean, I think he said something like that, which I found attractive.
Thanks. Well, it's funny because I can't remember who wrote what anymore. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, well, in any case, that clicked for me quite nicely the way you put it.
Thank you.
But the, this question of power, what's driving that power? What's behind it? And I see it in an economic sense or a business sense, if you will, or societal sense, is our need to focus on individual things because we can measure exactly what it does and where it's going and so forth and so on. That kind of information can be protected by intellectual property regulations and laws. That in turn is necessary for something to be monetized and to perhaps be sold in the marketplace. So it's really economy and our economic model that has a lot to do with that. So, for example, in the case of nutrients, to be more specific, if we can take one nutrient, and if we know exactly what it does, which mechanism, we have some clever new idea of what it does, we have to describe it exactly that way, we have to show the evidence, this is the way it works, and maybe we get a patent. However, in the case of nutrients, there's another twist to that that's really interesting. We can't take a nutrient in nature and get a patent for it, because we can't patent natural things. So in that particular case, we take that chemical that comes out of the plant, let's say, it's got some interesting properties. We would call it a nutrient, but we can't quite patent it. That's why nutrients can't be patented. So what one then has to do is to make a chemical derivative of it, in which case now the product is foreign to our bodies. That's the basis for the whole drug industry. Because the drug industry, the pharmaceutical industry, are always looking for, possibly new drugs. At least in nature. That's why they like the forest. They don't want the forest to be torn down because they get a lot of, interesting new chemicals that have that when tested has some interesting properties for sure. And they'd like to maybe use them, but they can't patent them, so they have to make a derivative. Mm-hmm. And they depend on the proposition that maybe the derivative will have more targeted effects or even more reductionist effects, and so forth. And so, I think what this concept of hold does, amongst many other sort of implications and inferences, it begins to explain, really, for me at least, what the basis of the whole pharmaceutical industry is all about. Mm-hmm. And that once you get a foreign compound, in that case, now the body has to deal with that. The body's really good about doing a lot of good things, but it has to spend some energy to figure out how to do that, to get rid of that. And in the process, all those chemicals that are discovered that way and then are transformed a little bit chemically, they'll end up having side effects. Because then by the time that they're administered, the dose has to be chosen, the timing, the schedule of dosing has to be chosen. And, that's not, we just do that for convenience oftentimes, or maybe for economic reason, but we do it. And and oftentimes these things are used totally out of the context of nature.
Well, it creates an industry of people who talk really fast on TV and radio ads saying all the side effects.
That's right, all the side effects, and that's so commonplace anymore. I think people just assume, well, that's part of the game. I think it's getting to a point where they don't even much care about those side effects. I just want just give me the big story here. That's all I care about.
Right. Well, I think one of the stats in the book is that I think the average senior citizen in America is on 8 different pills, and the second one was prescribed to deal with the side effects of the first, and then they just continually piggybacked one on the other.
Right.
So that's the pharmaceutical industry.
Right.
We also find, I was just taking out the trash, and I saw on the wrapper for the oranges we just bought, high in lycopene. So
no, orange. You say orange is lycopene? That's supposed to be a tomato-specific thing.
I just saw it on the oranges.
Oh, you saw it on the orange?
They're ruby red oranges.
Oh,
so
okay.
maybe they've injected lycopene. It was from a box I got at Costco.
Okay.
It said oranges are now high in lycopene because you can't advertise vitamin C anymore. That's old stuff.
Right.
But the idea, so now that so that tomatoes are good for us. Oranges are good for us. We know this.
Right.
But no one's going to get a dissertation or going to get funding for doing another study saying that oranges and tomatoes are good for us. We got to figure out the mechanism and the nutrients. So we discover this thing called lycopene.
Right.
And now what we can do is we can fortify other things. Right? We can extract lycopene, we can synthesize a version of it in a lab, and we can stick it in Pop-Tart. Right. So there's another way for people to make money.
Right.
Is to take these nutrients that we know are useful in the context in which they naturally occur, and then that we pull them out and make an assumption that they're going to be equally useful out of that context in a pill or a potion or a food, a nutraceutical, some enhanced food that has this compound in it. And the research shows that not only does it not help, it's often deadly.
Right. And by the way, you just used the word nutraceutical, which has always bugged me in a sense. If you look at some of the languages been created in the last 2 or 3 decades or so around this idea of nutrition, so forth and so on, that word nutraceutical, obviously, they took the word nutrition, made it sound like a pharmaceutical. So now, they're actually converting nutrition, if you will, into pharmaceutical ideas and products. The same way as the word with, instead of prevention, now it's chemoprevention. So that's a couple of words that just shows how pervasive is this idea of reductionism.
Right.
And treating holistic problems and so forth with a reductionist approach like that is ridiculous.
Right. One of the studies that shocked me the most that you cite is a study from Finland of beta-carotene, where they had to stop the study early because the supplement that was supposed to help people, the beta-carotene, was actually killing people.
That's right. It increased the risk for lung cancer in smokers, when in fact the hypothesis was reversed. In that study, the beta-carotene that was actually being consumed in the form of food, that was associated with a reduction in lung cancer cases. It was the beta-carotene that was being added as a supplement all by itself. That's what actually increased the risk. That was a classic case where here's a single chemical we're talking about in the presence of food doing some good stuff, not just because of its own action, obviously, but also because of all of the other things that were wrapped around it and working with it to create that response. Take it out, it's all gone. A naked nutrient. Just doing mischief.
Right. Now, in the book, we aren't gentle with a lot of the players in the industries. We talk about your own academic world. We talk about government. We talk about the media. We talk about pharmaceutical industry, the medical industry, a little bit about the food industry, although you cover that much more in the China study, and as well as like nonprofits like American Cancer Society and the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. But one of the points I think you kept hammering home is that most of the people in these fields are really good, and they're trying to do the right thing. So if we have all these people, and of course there's some bad apples, but by and large people are trying to help. The people who are putting the nutraceuticals together think that they're improving people's health.
Of course.
I know a lot of people in the pharmaceutical industry, all of whom want safe and effective medicines to help people save lives.
Sure.
So where is the problem if all these people are trying to do the right thing?
Well, that comes back to this word that we've used, paragon. Thomas Kuhn, I think, is the one who made the word probably most famous. And when he was talking about that, paradigm and perhaps a word, the sort of synonym in a sense to worldview. But I kind of like the word paragon. It's a sphere of thinking, as you know very well. It's a sphere of thinking that tends to have invisible boundaries around what we can think and what we can say. When we stray beyond it, it's basically heresy. It's a troublesome thing. And so people don't go there. You don't go there. And I like that sort of image in a sense because for me at least, when I started getting involved in this, we started things that I thought, well, this is heresy. How can I believe that? Kind of thing. But it's only after you accumulate enough stuff outside of that perimeter. And then all of a sudden, wait a minute, there's another world out there. Then you sort of step back and you look back at, where was it before? Then it's from the outside you begin to see the boundaries. And so I think that's kind of an interesting, I feel it myself because I know what happened to me. In thinking about this is that transformation in thinking. Unfortunately in my case I was so naive. I think as a young person in science, I mean, I was totally immersed in, you know, the real world.
Well, you're sort of dancing through the minefield, and you were lucky to avoid them.
Right, I guess. But, so anyhow, so good people are doing things that they believe in, obviously. Good ethical people, I think they're working hard, but they just somehow in their heads, you know, they sort of know what they think they know what they know because everybody told them this is the way it is, end of story. And so just, if you go out here, you're going to be labeled a heretic. No one wants to be a heretic, really. And so I just find that, yeah, a lot of good people are just doing those kind of things. They're the kind of people you'd like to have as neighbors and friends and so forth and so on, but because they're just like, well, just like I was. I know what it was like.
So what's your hope for Whole as it goes out, you know, birth this child, send it off to college, send it out into the world? What do you hope it will accomplish and help people with? Well,
you know, the way I think that I like to describe it, based on my own experiences, first seeing this concept of this awesome integration of things within cells. I mean, that's where I sort of started in many ways as a biochemist, you know, looking inside of cells and seeing this marvelous universe in every single cell. You know, all that stuff working together in these fascinating ways. I mean, that just kind of turned the thing on for me, and then realizing that there's more than 10 million of these cells, or whatever the number is. And there's colonies of cells that work together, and then there's colonies and colonies and colonies, each of which talk to each other. Then we learn that they talk to each other, these cells talk to each other, and then one's off in a distant planet, another organ, for example, they communicate, and on and on and on. That mere concept, the reason I want to make this point is because that mere concept of this networking and communication that goes on between all these life forms and all these parts, you know, that give us what we call life. That, to me, is a fascinating concept because it goes from the cells to colonies of cells to organs, and organs to people, and then people, you know, how they interact with each other. We could use more of this kind of thinking amongst ourselves as we look around the world. And then, you know, when you talk about different groups of people with supposedly superior attitudes, you know, it'd be nice if we could all think, you know, kind of work together like that we're all part of this domain, and then just going on all the way up as high as you'd like to go and as far as you'd like to see where's the edge of this kind of thinking. I just think the whole is just an unbelievably fascinating concept, and I actually think if we can start using that word, not just in biology necessarily, or in medicine or nutrition, but if we can start using that word, maybe in economics. You know, maybe, obviously, the social scientists do better at this than those of us in the hard sciences or the semi-hard sciences.
Although I think that a lot of social scientists have hard science envy and are trying to become reductionist enough to be taken seriously.
That's a really good point. That's an interesting point. In other words, they're already standing on fairly sacred ground somehow, and they're thinking that the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, which is kind of crazy. It does take the both. I mean, we need, as you have said before, the reductionist ideas. There's very useful research. It's fascinating research, and it actually enriches our understanding of the whole. If we didn't have that, you know, let's say we just only talked about the whole. Some people do. They don't. You know, of course, they can learn a lot of things and make a lot of good decisions, I guess, based on that. But it's a lot nicer to have some, the word usually, granular, you know, to get to know the nuts and the bolts, the parts, you know, that make that whole. Then you just staggering its implications.
Right, and I don't want to be too grandiose, but I really think that the thinking in this book is really necessary for the next phase of human evolution if we're not going to wipe ourselves out. If we're not going to destroy the planet, we need to stop looking at the parts and acting on them as if we understood what the consequences were going to be. That we have to become more holistic. You know, it gives us so much more leverage to achieve positive outcomes. Because the history of the last 100 years has been unintended consequences everywhere we look.
And it's the way to put it.
And it's because we're looking at such small pieces, and we're pushing the button here, and we don't realize that there's a bomb going off over there. We don't have this big picture. Well, I'm not going to be able to find it now, but one of my favorite passages is something that you wrote very early on about where, how are scientists going to be able to look into our cells and our DNA and find the sense of wonder at a sunset, or appreciation of a symphony, or love, or the things that make us human. That, arguably that's the stuff that's important, that really matters. And if you cannot go from the research you're doing to these big things, you're just going down a dead end.
I was at a meeting in fact, it was at the Boston Marathon. I was speaking to the medical group there just the day before that tragedy, just across the street. And there was a fellow there, a medical doctor, who got the China study. He got very excited about it. He heard my lecture. He passed on one of the nicest comments I've heard in terms of describing where it's going, kind of thing. I don't know whether he read the book or not, but he certainly picked up from the China study. And he knows something about the evolution of thought, transformation of let's say, societal thinking. He said right now, he was talking about medicine, he says, right now, he says, most people are unconscious and incompetent. They're unconscious of their incompetence. And so he says what the China study did is make us conscious of our incompetence. And so then once we become conscious of our incompetence, then we become conscious of our competence. And then the ultimate thing is to become unconscious of our competence.
Right, and then we'll start all over again at a higher level.
That's right. And so that's the way he was describing it, what you just asked, in a sense, is that is making that transition to the next level, in a sense. Maybe describing, our at least it was for me, I guess it may be others too, is describing how incompetent we are really. And so once we become conscious of that, that's an interesting idea.
Right. Well, and I'm hoping that, there's a lot of people who have read the China study, who have followed other thinkers, authors, who have shared this idea of plant-based nutrition being the healthiest way to eat for ourselves and for the planet, and yet we still have this doubt that we're still very vulnerable to, are you getting enough protein? Again, I'll put myself in that same group as other people. I have doubts about, there's so much societal peer pressure around how we should eat, how we should live, what we should believe. At the end of the day, if I got sick with something, I would probably say, yeah, but I need a drug. I really, those alternative things may be great, but where my faith lies is still in where I was brought up. And with this research that you have been leading the forefront of and collecting for 5 decades now, what that's done is it really has allowed me to break free and to look at evidence objectively. And sometimes the Western model wins, sometimes it makes sense, right. Sometimes it doesn't, but I'm no longer tethered by fear or habit to what society says. I feel like this material has allowed me to break free from this consumer culture and to really appreciate the incredible healing power of nature, of natural foods,
right.
Of the natural lifestyle. And so that's what I'm really hoping it will do for others. I know I was deeply immersed in it, but it just came yesterday. And I've been reading it, and I keep telling Mia, I said, "This is really good." I'm so, after a while, you're not really sure when you're working on it if it makes any sense.
I feel like I'm in that stage a little bit myself still, because I feel like the same thing with the China study. I thought there was something there was worth saying, and it was kind of interesting, but I didn't know. And I sort of feel like that. I don't know how many people are going to pick up on. Some people have picked up on this. The way the two of us are getting enthusiastic for it. I've already run into some people who have picked up on this. I don't know how many, but yeah.
I hope we're right. But I just look at this now after having kind of been away from it for 2 or 3 months, and I'm just so pleased that this is going out into the world. And I really send it out with a prayer that it will do a great deal of good for a lot of people. Yeah. And it's been such an honor to work with you.
Well, thank you.
This is
likewise. Goes both ways.
Wow.
Yeah.
So
got a product here we can go out and tell the world about it.
Well, that's what we're doing here right now.
Yeah,
So
I like this idea. This is great.
Okay. Well, it's the stuff wasn't cheap, so we got to keep using it.
Okay.
So
absolutely. Well, drugs too. I mean, we know that there's some drugs. If I'm really hurting really bad, I might want something to kill that pain for a little while to get myself back on track. So.
Right. I don't think we're not telling anyone, to be a complete absolutist,
No.
but just look, open your eyes to what the real evidence is, and not what those who stand to make a buck are telling you, because it's mostly spin, it's mostly out of context. It's a lot of half-truths, and there's just, a lot of it is not in our best interest. And this book really helps people,
Right.
I think, break free, so they can look at the whole evidence and see for themselves.
Yeah.
So, Dr. T. Colin Campbell, thank you so much for sitting down and chatting about the book, and let's go out and change the world again.
Okay, thank you. It's a good finish.